Good morning. Again, just want to welcome anybody who might be visiting us this morning. Just again, a blessed opportunity to be here amongst you, proclaiming the Word of God. Amen. And so this morning, we move into a section here as we continue to close out the book of James, chapter 3, that we start to look at a couple different types of wisdom. But it also kind of opens our eyes to this concept of conflict. Now, I'm sure most of you would agree with me, in today's world, conflict is just about everywhere. Lady Astor, going back to the days of Winston Churchill, Lady Astor once said to Churchill, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would put poison in your coffee." Well, Churchill responds with cutting wit, of course. "Well, Nancy, if you were my wife, I'd drink it." Now, we laugh at his sarcasm, but ultimately it reveals that most of us are predisposed or prone to choosing a path of conflict. See, human beings have been at war with God ever since the days of Adam and Eve. And as we transition from Adam and Eve to Cain and Abel, we see that eventually that there was conflict there that led to the killing of one of the brothers. And we see that even to this day, mankind is battling against other people who were ultimately made in the image of God. Even when it comes to Christians, and I think to the context in which James is talking to, the people that James is talking to, the early Jewish church, we see conflict within the church. In fact, I've even heard it said that when church members gather together, there will eventually be conflict. And I've seen this in business meetings where you get into a battle of chairs versus pews, organ versus piano, piano versus guitar, traditional hymnals versus modern day worship. We see that our words can lead to conflict. And as we pick up in where we left off last week, we are talking about our words, but we're talking more so about the wisdom that is displayed in it. So last week we talked that we can be controlled by such a small but yet powerful device, that our tongues can ultimately control us. Our tongue has the power to direct us, to destroy us, to delight us and build us up or bring us down. And so this morning we're going to look at the wisdom that comes behind the proper use of our tongues. And again, with everything we look at here in the book of James, we're ultimately looking at the truth of what we believe in, the truth of the gospel, when we've ingrained it, when we've adopted it into our lives, being lived out and displayed to others. So if you would, open up to James chapter 3. And this morning we're going to pick up in verses 13 through 18. So starting in verse 13, it says this: "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, is without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." So this morning, as we look at these two types of wisdoms, we're going to look at what it means to live out, to follow through the way of the wise and abandon the earthly wisdom that says here leads to hardship. And to first do that, we have to understand that followers of Jesus are challenged to demonstrate the wisdom that they have inherited, the implanted Word of God, in their behavior. So look at verse 13. Verse 13 opens with this rhetorical question from James when he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" Clearly, that was not on display. I mean, James is writing to a church that is scattered. We learned earlier in chapter 12 that these are the tribes that have been scattered out who are under persecution and clearly adopting the ways of the areas in which they've been scattered to. So clearly, they're not wise, they're not understanding, they're conflicting. And the second half of verse 13 here leads us to show how this wisdom that James is speaking of is actually measured. You see, it's not measured by degrees, but it's measured by deeds. And James wrote, "Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." That phrase, good conduct, speaks about a beautiful behavior. See, the idea is that you turn back to the truth, that you rely upon the truth and you live out the truth. It's beautiful behavior that we'll learn here shortly bears good fruit. But you see, I think one of the problems that we run into today is this good life that James is alluding to does not compare to the good life that we actually seek. You see, the good life for many today is wrapped around possessions, power, popularity. And I'm going to pause there for a second. Last week we talked about the power of our words, and we compared it to the increase from when it was created in 2006 to today, how we can go from 5,000 tweets a day in the Twitter world or verse or whatever it's called to 5,000 per second today. We also see with those platforms that you're gauged upon how many friends or followers you really have. And there we see that principle of popularity play out. But we also see that in today's culture, we measure the good life based on the pleasures that the world offers us. So when we go back to this principle that James is talking about, we see that it says to show his works. And that in of itself is an emphatical imperative which refers to putting the deeds on display. Again, when it comes to what James is teaching, he is stressing that if you truly believe it, if the Word of God, if the gospel of Jesus Christ has been implanted in you, it should change you, and that should be on display for all to see through your works. This concept, which goes back to what James says in chapter 2, says, "I will show you my faith by my works." It is put on display for others to see, to inspect, to witness, and to be changed by. Jesus, in Matthew 7, would equate this type of wisdom with obedience. In James chapter 7, verse 24, he says this, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock." Our wisdom, when it has been implanted in us and has lived out and displayed obediently, is showing our firm foundation in that truth. Now, this word meekness, I get it. I'm a guy. I went to school, I went to high school where you've got to put on that tough display. And as a father, as a husband, you want to come across as this rough-nosed, hardworking, solid person who can stand the test of time. And so this concept of meekness probably comes off as a bit of a weakness or to be gentle, and it might be something that we look down upon. Well, truth be told, that was the case back when James had originally wrote this, back when Christianity was really coming on the spot, when followers were coming to Jesus. This concept of meekness and humility was not looked upon as a good trait. It was actually looked down upon. But the word meekness here is not stating weakness. What meekness is alluding to is that it's power under control. See, meekness here was used in this type of concept of the high-spirited horse who was being broken or trained to be useful, to be loving, and to provide. So a wise person here who has this characteristic of meekness is actually a strong person who lives under God's control. And wisdom ultimately is demonstrated through their acts of humility towards others. See, a true test of wisdom is works, not words. Last week we talked about how we could offer up good tidings to our neighbors. Well, be warm. Hopefully that the housing situation, talking to the poor as they were last week, hopefully that comes about and solves itself. See, if I left those words with that person, am I really showing compassion? Am I really showing love to them? Or ultimately, am I giving a false wisdom, a false heart, and false hope to that person? James here in verse 3, in these verses, is reminding us that we are to live out the truth, to be changed by it, and to live it out, not in words, but in our actions. And as we look at the rest of these verses here in chapter 3, we begin to see this contrast between being a peace breaker and a peacemaker. See, a worldly person breaks peace. And I think we can all agree upon the culture we see today where there is more fighting, there is more chaos out there in the world than there are those who are standing making peace. We don't see those headlines. We see the headlines of hurt, discouragement, and a lack of hope. And ultimately what we're seeing is what we're about to read here in verses 14 through 16, which is that this type of response is false wisdom. It's not the wisdom. It's not the way of the wise. It's not a godly wisdom. Verse 14, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Now, in our age of texting, we have these acronyms. Some of them you may know, IDK, LY, maybe TTYL. But I recently came across one I actually did not know, and that is WIIFM. And that stands for, what's in it for me? Isn't that our culture today? Don't we promote a what's in it for me type of reality, that your happiness is defined by what you're getting out of it? I mean, I see that in dealings with marriage. I mean, there are so many people out there who think the marriage is all about what they get from the other person and not what they can contribute to the relationship. What is in it for me? See, this is the type of worldly wisdom that is corrosive. It's corrosive when it's all about me, myself, and I. And James uses these words, bitter envy, self-seeking. See, to have bitter jealousy is to want something that you don't have. And to allow that to build up this bitterness where it continues to pour in you, and it turns you, it taints you, it sours the soul. And self-ambition, well, that's all about getting yourself ahead. It's about building yourself up to become what you desire, even if it means to do so in an unethical manner. Maybe you have to hurt people or put them down to achieve what you think would be prosperous to you. And that's not godly wisdom. That's worldly wisdom. That's the wrong type of wisdom. See, this type of behavior, this characteristic is a false wisdom, and it will destroy unity. It will destroy unity, but it will create something. It will create rivals, dissension, hurt, pain, suffering. See, this type of false wisdom is what led the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. It was their envy for Jesus that led them to deny the person of Jesus and the power of Jesus. It was this envy that they had that created this disdain that ultimately led to the plotting and fulfillment of Jesus' death. So where does this wisdom come from? Well, verse 15 says this: this wisdom does not descend from above. This wisdom is not a heavenly wisdom, but is earthly, sensual. Maybe your translation says unspiritual there. It is an unspiritual and demonic wisdom. Paul refers to this in Ephesians chapter 2 as a triad of enemies to the world. See, he refers to it as worldly wisdom, as wisdom of the flesh, and wisdom of the devil. And let's look at those real quick. What is earthly wisdom? Well, a lot of people would define this, or we might define this, as wisdom that is made up by worldly things, worldly measures. It's wisdom that has no recognition of God. Unspiritual. Well, in the Greek, this at the time meant animal-like. It speaks of a sense of survival. And the idea of this unspiritual, this sensual wisdom, is that it's a wisdom, much like we talked about a few weeks ago, that is controlled by your emotions. See, it's a wisdom in which you do what you think feels right. And again, there's zero acknowledgement of God. And last here in verse 15, we see this demonic wisdom. It's this powerful, the strong word meaning demon-like. And it's very similar to the verse we read last week in chapter 3, verse 6, when we said the tongue. See, the tongue is set on fire by hell. It's this wisdom that may know God. It can probably quote scripture, but it's not real, valid wisdom. It's not the wisdom that provides life, and again, has nothing to do with Jesus Christ. See, the truth is, we are surrounded by these types of wisdoms. We have these earthly, unspiritual, and demonic influences all around us, because the truth is, we live in a whacked out, pretty messed up world. And if you don't believe me, turn on the news. They do a really good job of highlighting how messed up our world really is. And that reminds me of 2 Timothy chapter 3, in which is written, "But understand this, in the last days there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its powers." Some of you might be familiar with this thing. It's called Momo. It was this really huge thing that came out, I think mainly on YouTube. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not as well versed as I probably should be as a parent. But I know that there was a lot of controversy as it was really taking hold. And there's a lot of concern about it potentially leading to children, and I think it has actually led to kids who have performed acts of violence, acts of hate. And of course, there's always two forms to the platform. There were those who are strongly against it and are still strongly against it, and there are those who were kind of just writing it off as an internet fad. People playing pranks. It's nothing. It'll go away. Now, there's two stances. There's two levels of wisdom that are being displayed there. But I think as Christians, we should take maybe this stance. And this is coming from Melissa Edgington, who spoke about the view that we as Christians should have towards worldly things. And she said that we as Christians, see, distrust of the world should be what marks us as Christians. We should not be conformed by the world. We should not allow our trust to be here of worldly things because we're not of the world. See, as Christians, we should have enough wisdom to understand that we can't trust the ways of the world because it's the ways of the world that cause hurt, pain, and suffering. It's false wisdom. And the Bible teaches that this is not our home, that in fact we are aliens in this world that seeks to destroy us. So if we believe in the Bible, if we believe in it to the point that we lean upon it for wisdom to inform us, we then have to lean upon it to allow transformation to happen within us and how we act with those around us. Again, the world is really bad. The world has suffering and pain and conflict all around it, which is why we need to respond accordingly. I have another illustration here. It comes in two ways, where this envy, this self-ambition really has its effect on us. The first one pulling from Scripture, where Paul writes about the church of Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And he says these words, "Perhaps there may be quarreling, jealousy, anger, hostility, slander, gossip, conceit, and disorder." Now, we might look at that and take it in the context in which I'm presenting it to you and say, well, Paul's writing about the community and the world around him. But no, Paul is writing about the church. In fact, one of the most famous verses we lean upon in Corinthians, the chapter, the section of love, when you look at it, when you study it, is actually written to the church. Love one another. It's not about your gifts. It's not about one-upping one another. It's about building up, not tearing down. That is the characteristic. If we are going to love our neighbor, it starts in the church. In fact, over the last few weeks, few months, between Dorian and myself, we've had this constant theme to love one another, to love our neighbors. That is the mark of being a disciple of Jesus Christ. And as Paul's alluding to, that word disorder describes instability, chaos, confusion, anarchy. But we must remember, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians, God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. A good example of just how messed up this world is, of how we can break peace in our daily lives. An individual by the name of Carl Erickson, a South Dakota man in his 70s, was sentenced to life in prison after admitting murdering a former high school classmate. And after the murder, Erickson's secret had come out that for over 55 years, he had nursed a grudge towards the classmate. What did this classmate do? Well, this classmate simply pulled an embarrassing locker room prank on him. Now, I'm sure that every one of us at some point in our life have been guilty about pulling a prank, about sharing maybe a crude little comment or a little quick wit jab at somebody. And this is what we're talking about, just a simple, embarrassing prank. But this prank had planted seeds of resentment in Charles. which had continued to grow for over half a century. And after harboring bitterness in his heart for so long, he had rang the doorbell and committed the crime. Murdering a life over something that had taken place some 55 years prior. In my studies, I came across this very interesting kind of question. It pops out of a magazine, which says this: if you could push a button and thereby eliminate any person with no repercussions to yourself, would you do it? Well, this poll, this question that they asked, had a staggering 60% in which people had responded, yes, they would. And one man asked an even more direct question, which was, if such a device were invented, would anyone live to tell about it? Have you been pushing any buttons lately? Are you nursing a grudge? Are you a peace breaker? Because if so, you're operating according to worldly views, worldly wisdom. See, a worldly person breaks peace, but a wise person makes peace. And that's our last point for this morning, which is that godly wisdom is the way of the wise. We are called to be peacemakers. Look here with me in verse 17. We begin to see this contrast of wise versus worldly, of heavenly wisdom versus earthly wisdom. And James starts out saying this, but the wisdom from above. See, right here, this is James tying back to the very first chapter in verse 17, chapter 1, in which he wrote that every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, the God who does not change, who does not stray, who is consistent. He is the one who provides this gift. So what is this difference, this huge difference between earthly wisdom and godly wisdom? Well, it's this. Wisdom from below, wisdom, earthly wisdom, comes from reasoning. And the greatest illustration I can to show of this is the illustration of the cookie jar. And if anybody has kids, probably knows what I'm talking about. We say, hey, no cookies, no dessert before dinner. Don't want you to spoil your dinner. Well, what happens? Well, as the kid, we start this justification process. Well, surely one cookie is not going to spoil my appetite, so we reach in, we take a cookie. But then, if you're like me, and you like Oreos, you can't stop at one, right? I mean, it's like the Pringles commercial. Once you pop, the fun don't stop. So you can't stop at one. You just got to keep partaking of it, and before you know it, you've spoiled your dinner because you filled up on an entire batch of cookies. Now, I speak this not only from personal experience, but as experience as a father who, when he buys Oreo cookies, someone pops, the fun don't stop, and dad gets no Oreos. We create this reasoning. All that to say, we create reasoning to justify this earthly wisdom. To say, you know what, I can act this way, I can behave this way because it's okay, because you know what, they're not really getting that hurt, and I'm getting what I need out of it. Again, what's in it for me? But the other difference, the other type of wisdom that James is talking about, this heavenly wisdom that comes from above, comes from revelation, comes from God teaching us, changing us to be more Christ-like. So instead of having bitter envy or selfish ambition, we're called to have this biblical wisdom which operates completely differently than the world. And we see this in verse 17 as James says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality, and without hypocrisy. See, here there are two main distinctive types of wisdom that come from above. The first is purity. It's this quality which refers to holiness. And Jesus puts it this way in Matthew 5, verse 8, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It's not about the ways of the world. It's not about what I get out of it. It's about glorification of God and allowing Him to change us no matter the cost. See, the pure put aside the vices of self-seeking natures, all for the betterment of their community. And put it another way, a little bit more modernized, which comes from the movie, The Black Panther. It's a Marvel movie. Some of you may have seen it. But the main character says this: "The wise build bridges, while the foolish build walls." See, the wise look to bridge the gap between their community to see where God can work, whereas the foolish, those driven by worldly wisdom, construct walls to separate those who are different from them. And the second type of wisdom that James is speaking to from here above is this peaceable type of wisdom. See, where purity speaks of one's relationship with God, it's peaceability that characterizes our ability to get along with those who were made in His image. Peaceability here is literally peace promoting. It translates to peace loving, peace building, peacemaker. So if you find yourself looking for a fight, and I'm guilty of it. If you watched last week's sermon, if you joined with us last week, I said that I am guilty of using my words even in a way that I thought was neutral with my wife. Ultimately, by not directly responding to her with words of love, with words that build up, I'm essentially looking for a fight. I'm creating strife. I'm creating hardship. I'm creating anarchy that doesn't have to be here. And trust me, when I do that, it creates anarchy. It's not peaceful. It's not pure. Now, James goes on to list 6 other qualities which describe a peacemaker. And as we walk through these, as we take kind of an inventory on them, I would challenge you to see how you would measure up with these. And so, moving on, we see that the next trait would be gentle. It's this gentleness. This idea of being forbearing. Are you gentle? Are you reasonable with others? Or would people say, well, you're kind of a harsh person and hard to get along with? The next one here is submissive. Someone who's open to reason. The question I ask is, do you have an open-minded attitude? Or are you always the type where you need to be right and you need to have things done your way? A great illustration of this, coming from Genesis chapter 13, is Abraham, in which he comes to a compromise with his nephew Lot, giving him the best land, where he says, look, if you want the land on the left, go to the left and I'll go to the right. If you want the land on the right, go to the right and I'll go to the left. Ultimately, there's no need to have a fight, to have an argument over the land. The land is plentiful, regardless. See, he compromises, he submits for the greater good, not for his own. James goes on to say that the mark of those who are wise, who are living wisely, this godly wisdom, is someone who is full of mercy. Now, as a Southern Baptist, we might see the word full and instinctively go to our stomachs. We are full, we are satisfied, no longer hungry. But another definition of full is to be controlled by. To be full of mercy is to be someone who is controlled by compassion for those who are hurting around them. And last week, when we read through James chapter 3, we saw that when our words are empty of actions, are we really, truly showing compassion? Compassionate people who are full of mercy look for practical ways to help. And it's a trait that defines our Father. Luke chapter 6 says this, "Be merciful as your Father is merciful." We are to care for those around us, those who might be hurting, who might be suffering, which leads to our next characteristic that James says, which is that those who live the way of godly wisdom bear good fruit. It's evident in your life. Galatians 5, verses 20 through 23 say, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, fruitfulness, gentleness, and self-control." Do you have these characteristics? Or would you be defined again as harsh, stubborn, hard-headed? If you ask my wife, sometimes I am. Not happy about that. Actually, that kind of hurt me this week as I was going through these characteristics and thinking about it. We get to these last two. And ultimately, the first, the characteristics 2 through 6 speak about how true godly wisdom should be displayed towards other people. These next two speak to the essential nature of that true wisdom. And the first one of them are impartiality. Do you show favoritism amongst people? But just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how it is a sin to show favoritism to one person over another. But I ask you again, if a janitor walked in and a CEO of a Fortune 500 company walked in, who has your attention? Who's getting the best seat? Who are you leaning upon and providing for, caring for? Are you showing favoritism to one person, or are you showing them both the same level of love? And the last is sincerity. Are you genuine? Do people see you the same way they would see you on a Sunday morning, on a Wednesday, or a Tuesday? Are you the same type of person who comes and worships God on a Sunday morning and goes and worships Him on the job on a Friday? Or would people see you in your actions and call you a hypocrite? Our last verse we're looking at this morning, verse 18, James uses another metaphor to compare wisdom, and he does so with a seed that is sown. See, the root of godly wisdom results in some very attractive fruit. In verse 18, he says, "Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And here I see two responsibilities here in this verse. The first, we must sow peace. The word sow or sown is a word for planting and scattering. See, when God grows purity and peace within us, we then have the responsibility of planting the same into other people. And the second responsibility that we as disciples of Jesus Christ have is we must show peace. The phrase, make peace, literally means to do it, create it, work at it. Peace must be actively made because it doesn't happen by chance. Peace won't happen if we just hope for it to happen. We are to be active participants, to be active drivers, seekers, doers of peacemaking. Because if we were honest with ourselves, if we looked in the mirror and we were 100% truthful, we know that left to ourselves, we would drift towards divisiveness. Much like that opening illustration of Winston Churchill, truth being told, much like the illustration of how I can sometimes respond to my wife, we, when left to our own, are constantly at risk of drifting towards conflict. So if the root is right, the fruit will be right. But if the root is wrong, the fruit will be foul. And here's a good example of that. In 1930, the Chicago Examiner ran a story about a man named Harry Havens. And after one of many arguments with his wife, he shouted, "All right, if that's the way you feel, I'm going to bed. I'm going to stay there for the rest of my life. I don't want to see you ever again." And he ended up staying in his bed with a blindfold around his eyes. I don't know why he had to have the blindfold. I guess she had to walk into the room. I guess he didn't change rooms, but he stayed there in his bed with a blindfold around his eyes for 7 years. And the article concludes by saying he got up, finally, when the bed started to feel uncomfortable. He didn't get up because he wanted to resolve the conflict of his wife. He got up because he was no longer being benefited by the action he chose to take. So I ask you, are you blinded by any bitterness in your life today? Do you have any unresolved anger towards your spouse, your kids, your parents, your boss, a friend, or maybe that neighbor next to you who you don't know? Hebrews 12, verse 15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Hebrews 12 makes it clear we must do whatever it takes to not let bitterness grow in the soil of our soul. Because when bitterness breeds, it will always lead to an offspring of antagonism, which then leads to hurt to those around, which leads to a destructive path. Think of it like this. It's like swallowing a bottle of poison and waiting for the person that you're upset with, the person that you have bitterness towards, to die. Do not allow your hurt to turn into hate. You can become bitter or you can become better. The choice is up to you. The claim, the promise of James 3:18 here is that the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace, but it's sown by those who intentionally make peace. It's better than staying in an uncomfortable bed of bitterness. So, church, as our worship team's coming forward to close us out in one last worship song, I have a few ways in which we can practically apply this to our lives. And the first is this: make sure you yourself are at peace with God. If you have not yet put your faith, your trust, surrendered lordship to Christ, the Bible clearly says in Ephesians chapter 2 that you are at war with God. It's time to have a peace conference with the Prince of Peace. You yourself must make peace with God. Secondly, be at peace with those around you. We're not called to be judges of the world, to cast judgment, to spread hurt, pain, and suffering. We're called to witness to God's love. The same God who provides us peace, who provides us salvation, is the one that we witness to those who need it around us. So help others who are in conflict. And lastly, I leave you with this. Lead others to be at peace with God. Who's that person in your life, just that one person who you can share the gospel of Jesus Christ with? Who you can extend that love offering? Again, Ephesians 6 says, the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. We have been changed by the grace of God. When you are a disciple of Jesus Christ, we are called to therefore take what has changed us internally, the implanted word, and spread that with our words, words of hope, words of encouragement, words of love, words of peace to others. This is the fruit of life. This is what we are called to do. So, church, I encourage you today, take that moment and see who it is that God would put on your heart to spread that gospel peace, that gospel love with. And do not go to bed without first having had that conversation with them. And if you're at a point where you do not know that peace yourself, now's the time. Now's the time. As we go to the Lord in song, in worship, I pray that you would reflect on where it is you stand in your relationship, your personal relationship with Him. Do not leave here today without knowing 100% where you stand. And if you have questions on that, I pray that you would reach out to us, to one of our elders, to one of our deacons, to myself, so we can have a conversation with you about how you can know for sure where it is you stand. Would you stand as we close in worship this morning?